All right, so let's skip past Chase for a second. He would love it if the whole episode was about him.
We could do one of those.
But no, it's actually Tech Tuesday, and today's tech is going to be coil spring science. All the little details about coil spring design and how that leads into spring rates, how it affects your ride quality, and dual rate springs, some of the formulas for that, and what all these manufacturers of springs have to go through and how that compares to maybe some of the stock springs that we love to hate. But coil springs are basically a torsion bar that's been wrapped into a circle. So what a lot of people don't understand is that a coil spring doesn't actually just compress like you expect a slinky or something from childhood like that would do. A coil spring, actually, all of that wire that's wrapped around in that spring is twisting and rotating. So imagine a coil spring if you could take the coil and go completely straight and wind it out perfectly straight and look right down the end of it. Now you basically have a sway bar or torsion bar in my hand, and it is twisting this direction. You now take that twistable torsion bar and wind that into a spring. That's how springs react. They're actually twisting the wire itself on a rotational force. If you were to cut this in half and you could look straight down the wire itself, the wire is actually... Imagine if you take a towel that's wet from getting out of the shower and you're trying to wring it out. As you take that towel that's this long and you wring it, it gets tighter and tighter. It gets closer and closer. The same thing happens with a torsion bar. As you twist it, it gets shorter. We'll now take that and put it into a coil spring and twist everything. It gets shorter. That's how a spring compresses. This direction and this direction is a length or relaxing of the twist, allowing it to compress or extend. When you're creating a spring, a couple things that are super important. One, spring design is number one. A close second, if not number one, is the material that you're using, because you want to have the highest quality material that isn't going to fail over time. Also, the wire diameter. Those three things, the design, the diameter, and the material itself, are going to give you actual spring rate. Up here at the top, number one, let's go with material choice. So high tensile steel, specifically in a chromium silicon combination. Most spring manufacturers, there's about 20 different grades of spring material. Most quality spring manufacturers are going to use the highest grade. We request only the highest grade, and anything that we actually have made for us. All of our springs are made in the US. We do have multiple manufacturers in multiple states so that they can keep up, but the criteria that we ask of our spring is the same. So they actually have to follow that QC process. So we know we're getting the same exact thing. Same as what the military does when they have multiple contractors for the same part on the shuttle. They know it's exact because they've given them criteria they have to follow. Good design. Good design is super important. If you don't have a good engineered design in the coil spring, that is the number of coils, the length of the system, the wire diameter of the coil, and also overall travel. So the amount of gap between coils so that when you compress a spring 10 inches, it doesn't go to bind. Those overall things in design can extend or create the spring's life. Also stops it from sagging or settling. If the material is right and the design is right, then you don't have those issues. In addition, twist, bind, and coil diameter. So how do you create a rate? Well, imagine back to where I started. This will make the dark web happy again. Long rod in my hand.
I'm sprung.
That is basically a torsion bar. So as you twist that, you have resistance. That is a rate, that's spring rate. So you can go larger diameter, and that twist is going to be stiffer. That would be a higher spring rate. Let's just say you go from 1 inch to 1.25 inches. That might go from, and this isn't technically accurate, but it could be 500-pound rate, might go up to 750-pound rate by changing that diameter. Same thing happens in a coil spring, but we do it in thousandths of an inch. So the wire diameter or coil diameter on a lot of these springs are anywhere from 400 thousandths to 560 thousandths in diameter, and 5 to 10 thousandths of an inch in diameter will change the rate as much as 50 pounds. It could be less, could be 20 pounds. You can go Larger diameter wire would give you a stiffer spring. More wire typically is going to be the same as having a torsion bar that's longer, and it gets softer spring rates by doing that. But more wire means more coils. More coils means less travel. Less travel means it could bind early, and that's a negative. So that's where design comes in. You want the right amount of coil, you want the right amount of gap for travel, you want the right material, and you want the right diameter of material, all of which combine to give you spring rate. So you've got coils diameter, you got bind to worry about, you've got twist to think about, overall design, number of coils, all create rate. So good design and good material, stress relieved ASAP. This is super important, and a lot of spring manufacturers don't do this, and this is something that is a good reason why stock springs have issues. Stress relieving. When you take a coil and heat it up so that it can be wrapped around a mandrel turned into a spring, when you do that, you create or put stress into that material because it was straight, now it's coiled, and as it's coiled up, it's got more stress on the inside edge of it, a little less stress on the outside of those coils, and it might get hotter or colder as it's wrapped around the mandrel to create a spring. So if you just leave that alone, then you create stress spots in the system, and you can have failures in the spring later on down the road. Now, within 15 minutes or so, you have to stress relieve that spring. So all of the springs that we have made are immediately wound onto a mandrel, and they're hot, and then they go into an oven where the temperature is brought up to a mean temp where the whole spring is the same temp instead of hot and cold, and it's brought down slowly in a controlled manner, which takes all the molecules inside those windings and bar that are bound up because they've been wound around a mandrel, and relaxes all those molecules and takes away the stress risers. That is something that most manufacturers do not do. All of our springs are done that way. That is one of the reasons why we just don't have springs break. And we don't have springs settle and sag over time like the factory ones do. Now, our springs are brand new, so they're going to take a set one time when you put them on your car, maybe the first 200 miles, but once they've done that, they won't take a set or settle any more than that, unless you put too much weight on the car, which most people do, and they wonder why it's so slow. But it has nothing to do with spring quality. Our quality is high. As a matter of fact, probably the highest. Next, ground flat. So this is a tolerance that you can tell the spring manufacturers to give you. Ours are ground flat to a degree of 2 degrees. Now, what's that mean? That means that when the bottom of the spring is actually sanded flat for a flat surface, and the top, it's ground to within 2 degrees of straight. So anything that's got more than 2 degrees of lean to it when it's sitting on a gauge is thrown out. It doesn't make our quality control, and that way we keep springs as straight as possible, very little bowing, things like that. What is industry standard? About 5 to 6 degrees is an industry standard. So you can buy a brand new one, put it on the table, it's going to lean over 5 or 6 degrees, and that's acceptable to the majority of the industry, not for us. We narrow it down to 2 degrees, which is really, really high tolerance. 2 degree tolerance, super tight tolerance on our springs. After that, they are shot peened. Now, shot peening extends the life of the spring as much as 700 times. Not 7 times more life, 700 times longer. What is shot peening? Well, you know what sandblasting is. You can blast sand into something to maybe clean paint off of it or whatever. Well, shot peening is using different media to actually pound the surface of the spring, creating a hardened surface, because you've got, say, metal media or some other style of media that's actually going metal on metal, and it compresses the molecules of the outside of that spring, gets rid of scale, gets rid of rough edges, and under a microscope, it gets rid of microscopic cracks because it actually pounds those cracks shut in a way, or takes the highs and the lows and equals them out, which, back to you, Steve, is less stress risers in a piece of material that is twisting. So the less potential for a crack to start and failure over time. So shot peening is huge to life expectancy, and it is a standard issue for our springs. Also gives a really cool surface, a smooth surface, when it comes to powder coating as well. But life of the spring is what we care about. Spring rates are held to within 3%, and that's measured at mid-stroke. Most spring rate tolerances are anywhere from 5 to 8%. So if it is a 100-pound spring, then they give that the okay if its spring rates or rates out 7 pounds under. 93 pounds on that spring, it would pass because they would still call that a 100-pound rate. Okay, we have a 3% tolerance. So only 3 pounds on a 100-pound spring will we allow before we actually throw that spring away. So ours are really, really high tolerance. Now, when you start dealing with 500-pound springs, it's a lot. So, 10% is 50 pounds, 7%, 40 pounds. So we don't want to have that kind of variance in our stuff. Ours is really, really accurate. Also, it's measured mid-stroke. The reason it's measured mid-stroke is because, Chase, the first inch of compression and
it's all that matters is the first inch
of compression are thrown out and not measured by the industry. That is standard issue. The reason is the first inch of compression is actually always going to be less spring rate than the rest of the travel of the spring. The first and the last inch are important because you have to know that is a no man's land when it comes to rate. The first compressed inch is less rate than the spring actually will be. The last compressed inch is more rate than the spring will actually be. So all spring rates are checked past the first inch, somewhere in the mid-stroke, Chase, where the meat and potatoes happen, right? So all spring rates are measured somewhere in the middle stroke of the spring to get rid of the first and last inch that are definitely throwaway areas and not accurate. And that is industry standard. And I'm going to go back to that because when you start putting springs on cars and you're only putting an inch of preload in it, you're still inside that area where the spring hasn't gathered the rate it's supposed to be. So that's why you have variance when it comes to the amount of preload that will get you what the ride height is that we suggest or what you expect. It's very, very hard to do and actually next to impossible to do, but we're going to revisit that. First inch is too low, last inch is too high. Spring rate is measured in pounds per compressed inch. So if you've got a coil spring that's 10 inches long and it is a 100-pound spring and you compress it 1 inch, then you would have gained 100 pounds of force. If you compress it 2 inches, that is another 100 pounds. So now you have 200 pounds on it. You compress it 3 inches, that's another 100 pounds. So you have a total of 300 pounds force on that. It's not exponential. So the first inch is 100, the second inch is 200 pounds an inch, the next one's 400 pounds. That's not how it works. It's 100 pounds for every single inch you compress it. Next, dual rate. So dual rate system, simply put, is going to be stacking springs. You're going to have a spring on top, a divider to separate the two springs, and you're going to have a spring on the bottom. So upper, lower spring, dual rate system. Dual springs, hopefully 2 different rates. They could be the same rates. But what we get a lot of questions about is, hey, you sent me a spring kit and the upper spring is the same part number as the lower spring. So you must have screwed up because you didn't send me a dual rate spring kit. Well, that's actually not true. So the upper spring and bottom spring can be the same, and you are getting different spring rates as you go from combining both springs together to where you contact the crossover ring and get into the lower spring only. And I have examples of that on the board. Here's the formula to allow you to do your own math at home. So to create or find out what the spring rate is of a combined upper and lower spring, you take the top spring times the bottom spring. These are rates. So top spring, I'm going to show you an example of, say, 200-pound spring. So 200-pound upper times the bottom, 200-pound lower, divided by the upper plus the lower. All right? So what's 200 times 200 is 4,000, right? So 4,000 divided by 400. Here's your math. 200 upper, 200 lower equals 100-pound combined. Now, we're going to do more math. I'm going to show you it's not simply just cut the thing in half. It's not that. You do have to use the formula. But if you have a 200-pound upper and a 200-pound lower, you don't have a dual rate problem. Like people call us and ask us why we do that. You have dual rate. You have a 100-pound combined rate between both when they're functioning at ride height. And as soon as you compress this far enough for the spring, lower spring to get into the crossover, it jumps from 100 pounds to the 200-pound lower spring rate. So a 200 over 200 goes from 100 to 200 pounds as it compresses. So 200 over 200 is 100 pound combined. It jumps into a 200 pound rate when you compress that thing a lot farther. So as you hit a big hit or a big jump, you get into the heavier lower spring because you've jumped off of a dual rate spring into a single. Let's just change this up a little bit. What if it's a 200 over 300? Okay, well, if you do the math, upper times lower divided by upper plus lower equals 120 pound rate. That combined rate between a 200 and 300 is 120 pounds an inch, so that's what you feel at ride height. And after you jump it and land it and compress it into the crossover, then it jumps into a 300 pound lower spring. If that's something that you can control without bucking, like from a rebound standpoint, then great. This is a good riding system and it's very progressive. Let's just take this 200, 300 and switch it. Now you got a 300 on top, you got a 200 on the bottom. This is typical. I'm more East Coast, I think, in snowmobile than it is anywhere in the off-road industry out here. But that's still a 120 pound rate. The math is the same. Still the same spring rates, right? 120 here, 120 here. But when you hit a big hit, it jumps to a 200 pound lower instead of a heavier 300. So you go from 120 to 200 instead of 120 to 300. Now, that might work good for you, or it might bottom out. It just depends on the geometry of the car, how you drive, which UTV it is. We've found cars that work out really well with less lower spring. Like an XP 1000 four-seater does not like a ton of lower spring as soon as you jump it into something. It likes a lot lighter spring. So that system is one we've actually tuned that way on purpose because geometry-wise, it's hard to control it. So, well, let's try and kind of knock something in the middle of these, right? How about a 250 over 250? Remember, this is dual rate because the combined rate is 125 pounds. And as soon as you land that sucker and get into the lower spring, it's 250. So this might be a pretty good happy medium if you were at 2 over 3 and the thing bucks when you land the car. You can't control the rebound because of the heavy lower spring. You go and flip the springs around and you made it a 200 pound lower instead of a 300 pound lower. Now it bottoms out everywhere. Well, it might be a good choice to go to 250, 250 and just increase the ride height spring rate just a little bit, but land that lower spring right in the middle of those two and see if it doesn't bottom out. Springs don't typically control driving style. Springs are pretty much controlling the geometry of the car and the weight that's on the car. Internal shock valving and how it's valved is more about your driving style. So springs in a little way, internal valving a lot affects, is mostly the affected thing on driving style. Last, nailing preload and ride height is almost impossible. You will always have to make adjustments to spring systems. Now, that doesn't mean always, but it means most of the time. Now, let me go back to what we talked about. Springs are not even rated by any spring manufacturer or in any quality control environment in the first inch of compression. What if you take a spring, dual rate spring, upper and lower, and you put preload into that system, you put 1.5 inches of preload into that system. That might be what we suggest. That might be a starting point for our spring kit that we give you to start from. But that means that 2 springs are sitting at 1.5 inches of preload. That means that both springs are sitting within that 1 inch of throw it out there, it does not count spring rate zone. And if you don't have accurate spring rates in the first inch, you can't get accurate ride heights when you're under 2 inches of preload. Now, we don't want to have cars with 2 inches of preload or more. That typically tells us that our spring systems are too light and needs more rate. So just the fact that we live on almost all UTVs and almost every spring kit within that no man's zone of spring rates can be anything that they want to be in that 1 inch of preload means that a perfect setup on one car that nails the ride height, we can take the same car with another set of springs and it may not be the same ride height. We can take the same springs and put them on a different car and they might be a different ride height. So for us to say, hey, you're going to get 17 inches of ground clearance with this much preload, it is a very educated guess. It's going to be the 50%, I would say, here in our shop when we install spring kits. We nail it about 50% of the time. The other 50%, you have to give it to the 1 inch of no man's land of spring rate that you're in, and it just might require more adjustments. 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, as much as 3/4 of an inch, no problem, up and down. It doesn't bother us or worry us that we didn't get the spring system right. It's just that it's sitting in that area that we don't know what the rates are.
So there's a difference between preload and actual preload. So just because you add 2 inches, there could be zero actual preload when it leaves this shop, or there could be barely any preload. So I just want to touch on that, because if someone did add 2 inches to a shock, it actually could be okay.
So there's a top of a shock, threaded body, preload collar, and coil spring on it. A lot of people think that this distance from here to here is preload. Just this open area that's showing. Okay, that is not true at all. That is not preload. Because what if this spring system, if you just raise this up a 1/2 inch, what if the spring system all of a sudden became loose? What preload is the difference between when the spring is soft and actually loose on the shock, and then how far down you ran this collar. That is preload. It could be 1 inch. It could be 1/2 inch to start with, and then you put another inch in it, which would give you a total of 1.5 inches. It is not how much shock body is showing. And a lot of people do not understand that. And they call us and go, I got 4 inches of preload in my car. No, you don't. You have 4 inches of shock body that's showing. You may have 0 preload on the spring. You might have 1 inch of preload on the spring. So when people call us back and they're like, I got 1 inch, it must be wrong. Nope. Could be exactly right. It might actually have 1 inch preload in it now that you put 1 inch in it. So we have all of our spring systems are set up in different ways, and you have to really trust that we've been here and we've done that, and we actually know what we're talking about when it comes to these. You know, we sell thousands and thousands and thousands of spring kits, probably 10,000 spring kits last year. Out of all of those, we had to send another pair of springs to 5 guys, ever. It's actually pretty ridiculous that we nail it as many times as we do. 3 things go into the quality of a spring. The material that's chosen, we choose the best material made. The design of the spring is going to give it the longest longevity and least amount of settling or sagging over time. And wire diameter, also all 3 of those things combine to give you rate. And the design of the spring ultimately is giving you that final rate and overall travel. Now, how do springs work? They are not compressed like you see them compressing that simply. Technically, the wire diameter twists, and you take that wire diameter and wind it into a spring. The whole spring is twisting, which is causing it to compress and extend in overall length. That is why when you have a spring go to bind, they break, because they're trying to twist as they touch each other. They can't twist anymore, and those forces bind up into the spring and pop them. Our quality control is extremely high. 2-degree tolerance on straightness, shot peened, spring rates are held to a 3% or less variance, and basically everything on here adds up to the highest quality spring ever made. We have them, lifetime guarantee, all made in the USA. Now you know how springs work, so you can try and design your own.